now like to invite Dr. Leena for her lecture. Ma'am.
Okay. Good evening, one and all present here. Thank you, Anshula. If I got, it's Mahima, right?
Mahima.
Yeah, thank you, Mahima, for that kind introduction. Thank you, Team IMPRI, Dr. Arjun Kumar, distinguished feminist, scholar, and an extremely kind and compassionate person, Dr. Vibhuti Patel. Thank you for having me here and for this opportunity. I think it's an absolute honor and a pleasure. And of course, I welcome all the participants, some of the distinguished participants, all of them are here. So glad to see you all. And congratulations for this very interesting 3-day immersive course on feminism and global social transformation. And I look forward to interacting with the participants. So the topic which was given to me is her, history of feminism, or should I say her story of feminism, right? So her story of feminism, her history, I mean, one wonders, where does it all begin and where is she in history? Because it has been a history of, absences, silences, and marginalization. And sometimes we wonder, where is she in history? Because we hardly get to know about her in our history lessons. Nonetheless, I think of, as Dr. Patel rightly pointed out, the legacy, the feminist legacy is a rich legacy spanning, a few thousand years. And let us delve into that history and let us retrieve, and some of that history has gone into the dustbin, and it's important for us to retrieve that history. So let me sort of begin by first sharing my screen. Is my screen visible?
Yes, ma'am. Okay,
right. So here we go. And I hope it's full screen. So as I said, it has been a history of silences, absences, and marginalization. So before we get into that history, first a little bit about feminism, or should I say feminisms, as Dr. Vibhuti rightly pointed out, since the 1990s, we have been using the term in the plural sense, because to basically drive home the point that we are talking about a diversity of positions within feminism. So feminism is not one, but many, just as there is no one woman, but there are many women. So we know that women do not constitute a homogeneous category. Also, before I get into what is feminism, it's also important for us to understand that feminism as a term, as a concept, has been constantly evolving. And the feminism that we know today is very broad, very expansive than what it used to be. So it has, in fact, responded to all the criticisms that came from the margins. So a little bit about this politics of naming. So feminism as a term, as again Dr. Patel rightly pointed out, is mired in all kinds of misconceptions and conflicting interpretation, and in fact invites a lot of backlash. So I invariably begin my class on feminism by asking students about what is feminism, and if they would label themselves as a feminist. And I get some interesting mix of responses from, feminism is about protecting women, furthering the interest of women, advancing the cause of women, and they have been wronged, and we need to correct this historical injustice. Too, feminism is anti-men, it's hegemonic, and they want to rule, they want to be too emancipated, want to do away with those, with the idea, want to do away with the role of a homemaker and mother, so on and so forth. And to answer the question on would they label themselves as a feminist, I have, over the years, I have seen roughly 3 or 4 categories that emerge. One group which says no, not at all. One group which says, yes, we want to be known as feminists, we would wear it with a lot of pride. Another group says, we still don't know, we are confused. And there's one group which is emphatic and says, no, we don't want that label. We don't want that. We believe in women's rights. We believe in gender equality. We believe in everything that feminism maybe stands for, but we refuse to call ourselves a feminist. We'd rather be women's rights activists, right? So, in fact, they say in this day and age, we'd rather not call ourselves a feminist because we will earn the label of a feminazi, and there's a lot of trolling. And when I say this, I'm especially addressing the younger generation present here, the younger generation of students present present here. So, the question that arises is, one is a little intrigued by this. Why is there this reluctance and this skepticism about feminism? I mean, if you ask me, I think it's one of the most progressive movements. It's highly liberatory and emancipatory, right? Then why is it that it gets associated with these kind of doubts, okay? And Barbara Smith, a feminist scholar, very rightly says, she says, feminism is one of the most threatening of all social movements, simply because it actually asks very difficult questions about the way we live, about our very existence, about the way we relate to one another. And it asks very critical questions about the most intimate of all social relationships, which is the relationship between a man and a woman. Right? And in that sense, it is perceived as very radical and revolutionary. But then, all right, if this is so, and I'm not getting into many women and many feminisms because I've told you about the diversity of positions within feminism. If time permits, we will come to that towards the end. But then what exactly is feminism? Very simply put, if I were to deconstruct it and try to make it very simple and neat for all of you, well, feminism is an ideology. It's a very rich and vibrant movement, which has produced a wonderful body of knowledge that validates women's lived experiences, right? Which involves a commitment to change the social position of women, a commitment that derives from a recognition of the fact that women have suffered material and social injustices that derive from their biological identity, right? And feminism is also an action system. As Dr. Vibhuti rightly pointed out, feminism, to say that I am a feminist and I believe in feminism is not enough, because feminism also means an action system. It means we need to speak up. It means we believe in change. We believe in transformation. So to be feminist is actually a political act, okay, about changing things, about transforming things. And that act of resistance needn't be something which is very visible, something which is like radical. It can be very simple as well. So my right to say no to, for example, the pressure to get married or to continue with my education, simple things can also be feminist acts. Here, I wish to introduce you to, over the years, there have been numerous attempts at understanding feminism, and we've had a number of theorists who've spoken about it. But one theorist whose perspective on feminism has stayed with me, and I'm sure with most of you, is, of course, Bell Hooks. She's no more with us, a Black feminist writer, cultural critique, feminist icon. In fact, her demise felt like a personal loss to me, at least. And her perspective and her views on feminism is something that I wish to place before you. And I would urge all of you to read her book, Feminism is for Everybody. She begins by talking about, she says, why is it that feminism, which has a lot of potential for an emancipatory and liberatory politics, why is it so misunderstood? Okay. And of course, she talks about the early feminist movement and the exclusivist nature of movement and not allowing men into the movement for being responsible for this anti-men sentiment that is associated with feminism. But for her, feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and institutionalized sexism. It's not a movement of women against men, okay? Because she says we all are patriarchal. I mean, let us understand that. Let us not be under any illusion. And I consistently say this: if you are a woman, you automatically don't become a feminist. So being a woman is not equivalent to being a feminist, because even women can be very patriarchal, and we are all participants in perpetuating sexism, no doubt about it. But of course, she does say that men as a group benefit a lot from patriarchy, right? And this also means that they play a role in perpetuating sexism. Sometimes when they even don't wish to, because they cannot let go the benefits and the security that comes from patriarchy. So we have some active perpetrators and we have some passive participants in the system as well. And of course, she emphasizes that it's important that we need to clarify misconceptions. However, she also draws our attention, and this is something which I think is very profound. She draws our attention to the interconnected nature of social oppressions, right? So she says, what do feminists want, right? Feminists basically want, they imagine a world where there is no domination, no hegemony, no oppression, where we are free to be who we are, and a world of peace and possibility. And then she raises a question. She says, do you think a feminist revolution alone will bring about this world? Right? Certainly not. We also need to end other forms of oppression. So we need to end imperialism, classism, racism, ableism, and if I may stretch this further in the Indian context, casteism as well, right? So she says, let us not be under this illusion that if we put an end to sexism and we achieve gender equality, the world will become a wonderful place to live in, because we still have to deal with racism, classism, casteism, ableism, and surely these cannot be wonderful experiences. And this is where, in fact, we get introduced to this whole idea of intersectional feminism, which is so much in vogue now. We need to understand, for example, how our social locations of caste, class, race, whatever, intersect in numerous ways to produce enabling and disabling experiences for each one of us, right? And she was a little opposed to this whole idea of feminism being about gender equality or talking about social and political rights of women equal to those of men, because she says feminism is not about becoming like men, certainly not. And she says, why would we want to become like men? I mean, this is a question that Black women asked in America. Why would we want to become like our men who are themselves unequal, I mean, who are themselves oppressed, okay, who are not equal in this unequal world? A question that even Dalit women asked here in India, right? When they spoke about how Dalit women spoke differently or talked differently, they said, we don't want to be equal with our men. So feminism is not about equality with men, right? Feminism is about fighting systemic inequities. It is about fighting entrenched, sexism that has deep roots in our society. It's about fighting systemic inequities and systemic exclusions. I think this is something that we need to, once we get hold of this fact, we will understand that feminism has actually been misunderstood a lot. It's actually a wonderful, wonderful ideology. And I think I especially wear my feminism with a lot of pride. All right, now getting into history, because that is what we are supposed to be doing here. When we look at the beginnings, right? So the proliferation of the feminist movement actually traces back to the 19th century. In fact, the term feminism emerged only in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so generally these two events are marked out as the kind of beginnings of feminism, which was the anti-slavery convention, which happened in 1840, and where women were not allowed to participate in this convention. They were not allowed to sit in the main hall. They were asked to sit in the gallery, and some of the women felt very offended and resolved that it was time now to ask for women's rights. And this, in fact, led to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where 300 men and women, led by people like Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia, they rallied in advocacy of women's rights after being denied participation at the anti-abolition convention in 1840. Apparently, this led to the first wave of feminism. But as Jackie Fleming, a British writer, very beautifully puts it, she says, there have been many waves before this, but all of this is lying in the dustbin. And it's time now for us to retrieve that history, right? So even though these two events and some events following this, right, have been marked off as the kind of beginnings of the feminist awakening or movement or whatever, the fact remains that there is a rich history of resistance, interrogation, a challenge to oppressive patriarchal structures that predates 1848. I mean, it goes into like 2000 to 2500 years. So let's go back to that era and see what were these, they may not have been collective acts of resistance, but they were definitely individual acts of resistance, right? All right. So if we were to begin there, and yes, feminism as a term was actually first used in 1871 in a French medical text, and it was used in a very pejorative sense, to refer to feminization of men or virilization of women. Okay. So of course, it was reclaimed later by the feminist, and we were kind of enriched by its legacy. So, and I thought a good starting point would be to go into the Greek civilization. So also because, this is, it's interesting to go through this history of widespread misogyny and sexism. And I'll take you through a very visual representation. It's also a humorous take, okay? And this was, of course, the era when biological determinism was pervasive and defined an understanding of social roles. And this kind of misogyny was ably supported by a so-called intellectuals, philosophers, biologists, anatomists, scientists, okay, who really, really believed, who firmly believed that women actually belong to the private sphere. Women have no role absolutely in the public sphere, right? And I begin with the Greek era, Greek civilization. I mean, it's the cradle. Greece happens to be the cradle of civilization, where we had wonderful philosophers like Socrates and Aristotle, and the birth of democracy in many ways. And yet this was also, it hid many things, the hidden side of misogyny and slavery and other kinds of mistreatment. Now, the first recorded example, and Mary Beard actually talks about it in her book Women and Power. She talks about the first recorded example of a man telling a woman to shut up, right? Telling her that her voice was not to be heard in public. Women are not supposed to be in public. And who was this? This was, I mean, all of you might be familiar with the Greek epic Odyssey. And it is about Odysseus, the Greek hero who was returning home after a victory in the Trojan War. And his wife was waiting for him at home. And wife and son, both of them were waiting for him at home. And his wife, Penelope, came down, okay? And there was a bard who was playing, and she told the bard to change the music because she didn't like it. And here rises her son, who is Telemachus, and tells her that, please retire to your room. Speech is not meant for you, okay? It's for me. Speech is my business, right? In the public space, speech is my business, not yours. So I think you need to, she, in front of everyone, she says, mother, he says, go back into your quarters and take up your own work, all right? And what was that work? The loom, okay, weaving. Weaving was one of the main work that women were supposed to do in Greek. And in this picture, you see the mother and the son standing in front of her, and the mother next to her loom. And he says, speech will be the business of men, all men, okay? And I have the power in the household. And off she goes back upstairs. I think this is where we need to begin, because, one of the greatest divides that we have seen, okay, and these attempts to fight and our struggle has been to have, to see that women have a voice in the public sphere, okay? The fact that we are completely identified within the private domain, and we are conveniently told that you have no role to play in the public space, which is why any kind of challenge, any kind of resistance is interpreted as an aberration, a deviance, an anomaly, and we are conveniently pushed into the household. I think this is where it all begins, right? So, so if I may, as I said, I'll take you through this visual representation. So the first women lived in the domestic sphere, and the source is, of course, an interesting book by Jackie Fleming. It is Trouble with Women. Again, something that I would ask all of you to read. It's very interesting. It's a humorous take on the position of women at that point of time. So the first women lived in domestic sphere, and you can see all that they were doing. They were cleaning, scrubbing, looking after children, cooking. And if you were middle class and you could afford, you will afford domestic staff who do your work. And then you could then maybe sort of do a little bit of embroidery and find time for these kind of creative pursuits, right? And if you happen to step out of the public sphere, of the private sphere into the public sphere, then you would be a fallen woman. And who are the fallen women? There are numerous ways of being a fallen woman. I mean, you have a mind of your own, you are too articulate, you're too opinionated, you speak your mind, and that's a problem. Or you have a side parting, you wear bloomers, you ride a bicycle, then you would be conveniently labeled as a fallen woman. You study too hard, you are very intelligent, you seem to know everything, then you are obviously a fallen woman. And there were quite a few in that era. All right. And now let us take a look, and this is a peek into history to understand how our wonderful intellectuals actually saw women, understood women, defined women. So let's probably begin with Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, of course, spoke about how, women have small brains and women are biologically inferior. So it's best that they're kept at home. And, they're good at nothing but simply crochet and needlework. And girls weren't allowed to go out because they were too emotional. They couldn't see properly at night. And so therefore, it's better to lock them up inside the house. And of course, Rousseau, the great philosopher associated with Enlightenment, he said, women have to be thwarted all the time. They have to be thwarted so that they can, so that their natural role of pleasing men comes to them more naturally. And if they're not thwarted, it can actually lead into all kinds of trouble. So let's keep thwarting them. Any attempt by the women to act smart, they need to be thwarted, right? There was a philosopher by the name Schopenhaver. He said a very interesting thing. He said, look, women really cannot achieve anything. Women are incapable. However hard they try, they may not be able to do it because they don't have genius hair. And how did genius hair look like this? And so women who had genius hair actually ran the risk of being labeled as mentally ill and being put in asylums, okay? And of course, there were interesting things being told about if women did science, then they would grow a beard, and that would, of course, ruin their prospects for marriage, right? And of course, I don't know if you know Baron Le Coubertin. He was a French historian and founder of the International Olympic Committee. And he said women must never play sports. They must not play sports because they're very fragile. They're prone to overheat. They have weak muscles, and some of them, if they end up playing, they might develop muscles, and that would be an unsightly sight. We don't want to look at those women. And women look good when they're clapping, not when they're throwing a ball. So it's best. And then, of course, the possibility of accidents happening and women losing their virginity. And can we afford that? Certainly not. Freud, of course, consistently spoke about penis envy and how this made women unfit for the exigencies of life. And, he kept talking about how therefore men carry the burden of civilization and women can't. And, he kept this painting in his asylum, which was meant for women. And what does this painting tell us? This painting shows as a professor who is demonstrating what is hysteria. And there's a woman there who has been hypnotized, and all the students are men. Right? And talking about how women look best, work wonderfully well under hypnosis, not when they are conscious, right? And one of his colleagues said, he said he used to give lectures on hysteria, and he said the typical hysteric was a female exhibiting more than usual force of character, bold riders, having plenty of what he termed as nerve, right? Again, someone who needed to be thwarted. We had Dr. Edward, who was a Harvard professor, and he says it's possible for her to study hard. She can come on top of everything. Well, he was a little different from the others, but he said the problem is this would damage her health and her children would be shriveled, right? So these are the weak hands, which is why women could not pick up a pen, could not paint, could not pick up a pen because that would cause chlorosis, which is a blood disorder, and of course that might lead to a uterine prolapse, right? These were exactly the things which were debated at that point of time. But of course, we do have some women who work in the public sphere. They were slaves. They were white working class women, right? So where do these go? Of course, these are not women because they have men's hands, right? So they're all fallen women. Picasso said women are meant for suffering, right? And we all know about his muses and how they died because of the way he treated them, right? Ruskin Bond said women's intellect is not for invention, but simply praise, right? Now, here we have, the former slave, Eliza Cryer. she was a very famous, she qualified as a teacher and doctor, but after going through years of turbulence and struggle, where she alternated each year of study with a year of cotton picking. And she was often cited as an example of a woman who has a wavering mind. So all women have this wavering mind. They are not able to focus like men, right? Also, if you studied a lot, there's a possibility of you losing your hair. So we had Anna Maria, who was the first female graduate in Europe and an acclaimed writer. She learned several languages, Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French. And this is what she was before. And after becoming enlightened, you see how her hair has fallen, right? But of course, in the midst of all this misogyny, in the midst of all the sexism, we had women who crossed boundaries, who transgressed, right? And these are the individual acts of resistance that I'm talking about, right? So we had Emmy Noether, whom Einstein described as a genius, and she was a mathematician. We had doctors, one of whom was Dr. Joshi from India, okay, who were apparently the fallen women, but they defied the norms, they challenged the norms, and they went ahead and they did what they were supposed to do. Annie Oakley, sharpshooter. Then, of course, we had Nancy, who rode on the horse across America. And this is again James Barry, and I don't know if you know James Barry's story, the famous army surgeon in America, who actually was born as Margaret Bulkely. She had to disguise herself and become a man so that she could study. In fact, many women in that era, in the century dating back to like 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, would in fact disguise themselves as men so that they could study along with others. Otherwise, very often they were asked to sit behind curtains and just listen to what the teacher was trying to say. So she was another woman who studied science and ran the risk of growing a beard. She could divide 9 figures by 9 figures, right? And that was like stupendous. So when African slave Phyllis Wheatley wrote poetry, 18 men actually came to check whether she has written poetry and whether she was capable of that, right? So, so from there, we move to the 11th century, right? And interestingly here, if you see, the first attempts at resistance actually happened within the religious framework, right? This was the time when many families would pack their daughters off, okay? The unwanted daughters, unmarriageable daughters to convents, right? Now, obviously, many of them saw this as a kind of punishment, but for some others, it actually opened up emancipatory spaces, and they found time to read, write, and to hone their skills, okay? Among them was, of course, Hildegard of Bingen, who was a nun. She became a saint, and she traveled extensively and to give her sermons, okay? And this was, in fact, a very dangerous time as well in Europe, because there was this great witch trial, which was happening between 15th and 17th century. About 80,000 people, a majority of them were women, were labeled as witches, and in fact were executed, okay? If you therefore chose to be different, if so, and some of these saints, women saints who questioned, for example, or who wanted to kind of do something different, but within a religious framework, ran the risk of being labeled a witch, right? And of course, many women who were traditional healers were also labeled as witch. This was also the time when, kind of modern medicine was taking shape. And this conflict between the traditional healers and the modern medicine, invariably, the doctors happened to be male. So witch hunt became a very convenient way of eliminating all women who were unwanted, who were creating a lot of trouble, who were asking all the wrong kind of questions and making life difficult for people, right? Then, of course, there was this Reformation, Church Reformation, and the two sects, Catholic Church and the Protestant sect, and women given also a lot of freedom within Protestantism. So the fact that women within a religious framework could choose to be different, could raise certain questions, like, for example, Eve was better than Adam, and a man's salvation essentially springs from a woman, right? So a woman is superior. These were the questions that were being raised, or these were the kind of, viewpoints that were being articulated at that point of time. This, some of the women in 17th century Europe were quite inspired by these. And, we had these writers, Pauline Dilvara and Sarah Feig, all of them wrote about how women actually constitute an enslaved class. So these were beginnings of those kind of feminist writings which happened. And they are often labeled as significant foremothers, right? And then when we move onwards, a very significant event was, of course, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, right? And it was here that Olympe de Gouges, okay, she proclaimed her Declaration of the Rights of Women. And this was, of course, in 1791. And, where she forcefully argued that woman is born free and equal to man. And she, along with Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women, who was from Britain, these two have been labeled as the initiators of feminist ideas, right? And in 19th century US, when we go back, this was, of course, Britain. When we go to the US, we see that the starting point, of course, was the anti-abolition movement. Many women were part of it, right? And many women realized that when they were part of the anti-abolition movement, their voices did not count. They were mute spectators. Men ruled, men decided. They were the decision makers. They decided everything. And women were asked to simply lie on the margins, beyond the margins. And it is this kind of denigration and devaluation which actually led to the Seneca Falls Convention and this emphasis on a woman alone kind of grouping where we don't want men. And it is perhaps from this stems this kind of anti-men sentiment that feminism is associated with, right? So, and of course, so this was, as I spoke about Elizabeth Stanton, who actually led the movement along with Lucretia Mott. They became feminists, and in 1848, they organized the Seneca Falls Convention, and they asked for right to vote, they asked for right to education, right for women to work, so on and so forth. So this was, of course, the first wave feminism. What is sometimes termed as second wave feminism emerged after the Second World War. In several countries. And some of the influential writings that begins with the second wave is, of course, Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, where she talks about how man is a self and women is always othered, and how women has been denied humanity all through, denied herself, denied her soul. Okay, we had Kate Millett writing about sexual politics, where she argued how she coined the slogan, very famous slogan, personal is political. And Kate Millett argued how there is power in every relationship and how patriarchy is actually a political institution. And the relationship between the sexes is one of subordination and dominance. Then we have Schuler Smith Firestone, who wrote The Dialectic of Sex in 1970. And she spoke about, along the lines of where Marx spoke about a class revolution, Schuler Smith spoke about a feminist sexual revolution. And she said the two classes which are which stand in opposition to each other and are in an exploitative relationship is not the two classes, but the two sexes, right? Men and women. Then, of course, came, and then, of course, there was German Greer, female eunuch. I really don't know how much time I have because I don't have a watch here, but how much time do I have, Mahima or Dr. Arjun? Can someone tell me?
And please take 5 to 10 minutes more.
Okay, so then I'm well within my time. Okay, so I thought maybe I was rushing because I thought I was falling short on time. So we had then, of course, bell hooks, and there were many of them in between. Bell hooks, of course, called out the early women's movement, and she was very critical of the early women's movement and spoke about how the early women's movement could not extend their boundaries to all women, how they were exclusivist, they left out different kinds of women, lesbian women, Black women, trans women, disabled women, and these were never, and she said the women who were oppressed the most could not find a voice, could not speak, were not made part of the movement. Okay, so she was very, very critical of the early women's movement. Of course, I'm going to conclude with a critique. And of course, I will raise certain questions for you to kind of reflect and ponder over, and maybe we could take that up in the question answer session. So when we talk about feminist history, we need to remember, of late, what is emerging is, and what I just told you, is we often see that feminist history is often structured around a limited caste, okay? It's generally located within a Eurocentric model within Europe and America, okay? These, in fact, have become our foremothers, right? Now, there is a danger here. There is a danger here because there is a possibility of we missing out on other kinds of feminist resistances in other parts of the world, right? Because when we make Europe the center of all our understanding of feminism, after all, what is history and where does history begin? This is the question that you need to ask yourself. History is recorded, right? Now, there are many groups, for example, there are many indigenous groups which don't have a recorded history, who have oral traditions, okay? And these oral traditions, oral narratives are still not a part of recorded history. So we really run the danger of not capturing those and not enlisting those, right? So this is one thing that I wanted to flag. Also, the history of, when we talk about the history of global feminism, some of the scholars have consistently been arguing, and that is in the last, say, for example, 10 years or so, or a little less than that, they've been talking about, they say that can we look at alternating points of origin? The point of origin is not one, right? Maybe there are other points of origin. So, for example, can we think of the Rosetta Women's Conference, which happened in 1799? And what was it? This was a group of Egyptian women who were protesting the French invasion of Alexandria. And they actually assembled to discuss about women's right to work and things like that. Or alternatively, can we think of the rights given to indigenous female householders in, for example, in Sierra Leone in 1792, a right, of course, that they lost when the country became a British colony, or the voting rights that were actually given to indigenous and settler women in New Zealand, much before their counterparts got the right to vote. Their counterparts in Europe and America got the right to vote. So perhaps I think we need to constantly guard ourselves against these kind of slippages which might happen when we are looking at, or we are trying to understand, the history of feminism. Also, very important is, and of course I have highlighted that before as well, that the history of resistance, of challenge, of interrogation goes well into the previous centuries, much before these two kind of events were marked off as kind of defining feminist moments in history. And finally, to conclude, as I say, feminism today is actually very different. Today, it has moved beyond the binaries, right? When we talk about feminism, we are no longer talking about men and women alone. We're talking about multiple genders, right? And this is and this itself, I think, is a very liberatory aspect of feminism itself, that it's open to criticisms. Feminists are open to criticisms. The movement is open to criticisms, and it responds wonderfully to the churnings within. And one of this has been that, we have left out people with non-normative gender identities, and we haven't included them enough. Thank you so much.